Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to the Neofusionist Book Review. This is not your typical book review, as I make no claims to political or philosophical impartiality. This podcast uses the format of a book review to explore the premise of Neofusionism. Neofusionism is the merging of paleoconservatism with naturalism within the framework of the revitalization of the Republican Party. We will be exploring politics, philosophy, psychology, economics, and sociology through a wide variety of books published both recently and historically. Thank you for tuning in. So for today's episode, we will be looking at Why Liberalism Failed by Patrick Deneen. And this was published recently, last year, 2018. And so, just like last episode, we're looking at a couple of fairly recent books that have been well received and people are talking about them. I figure we'll talk about them a little bit as well. This one follows closely on the heels of the last one, insofar as the last book, in describing making the case for nationalism, described the Protestant Construction as the arrangement of nation states that existed prior to World War II and was created from at the end of the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, and then was superseded by the liberal order after World War II. But the liberal order, I think, can be traced much further than World War II. Just maybe wasn't really as dominant before World War II as it was afterward. But this book talks about liberalism, makes some critiques of liberalism that are similar to the critiques that were made in the last book. And so it examines what liberalism is and then talks about a few reasons why it seems to have failed. And so we're going to look at that in some more detail, and I think this is an important book for us to read, an important book for people to read and understand, kind of as a framework of what's going on in this country and in the world, in all of the various problems that seem to be arising, both internationally, environmentally, things like that. The different challenges that we see, in a lot of cases, can be traced back not to something that needs to be repaired by liberalism, but something that was problems that were actually created by liberalism. So first of all, I'm going to jump to a section that kind of gives a basic description of what liberalism is. It proposes that it's founded on two related revolutions in how people understood human nature. He says, quote, "Liberalism is most fundamentally constituted by a pair of deeper anthropological assumptions that give liberal institutions a particular orientation and cast. One, anthropological individualism and the voluntarist conception of choice. And two, human separation from and opposition to nature. These two revolutions in the understanding of human nature and society constitute liberalism, inasmuch as they introduce a radically new definition of liberty." End quote. Okay, so that's those 2 points he makes. The first of these is the anthropological individualism and the voluntarist conception of choice. And we spoke about that a little bit last episode with the dedication of liberalism to the autonomous individual as opposed to the various groups to which one feels a sense of mutual loyalty and in which one exists without any choice or consent of their own. The second one he mentions is human separation from and opposition to nature. Now, our last episode did not cover this side of liberalism, and so in this book I want to pay special attention to that. But first, I am going to read a section where he talks about the first of those revolutions, anthropological revolutions, about the autonomous individual, because he talks about John Locke. Now, in our last episode, we talked about John Locke, and he makes a somewhat similar case, but I'm going to read this section just because it's nice to have another perspective and maybe back up and reinforce what we had looked at previously. But aside from this section, I'm going to try to focus most of what I talk about in this episode on that second revolution. But as far as the first revolution, he says, quote, Locke, the first philosopher of liberalism, on the one hand acknowledges in his second treatise of government that the duties of parents to raise children and the corresponding duties of children to obey spring from the commandment, honor thy father and mother. But he further claims that every child must ultimately subject his inheritance to the logic of consent, and thus begin, evoking the origin of human society, in a version of the state of nature in which we act as autonomous, choosing individuals. For every man's children, being by nature as free as himself, or any of his ancestors ever were, may, whilst they are in that freedom, choose what society they will join themselves to, what commonwealths they will put themselves under. But if they will enjoy the inheritance of their ancestors, they must take it upon the same terms their ancestors had it, and submit to all the conditions annexed to such possession. Even those who adopt the inheritance of their parents in every regard do so only through logical consent, even if it is tacit. Even marriage, Locke holds, is finally to be understood as a contract, whose conditions are temporary and subject to revision, particularly once the child-rearing duties are completed. If this encompassing logic of choice applies to the most elemental family relationships, then it applies all the more to the looser ties that bind people to other institutions and associations, in which membership is subject to constant monitoring and assessment of whether it benefits or unduly burdens any person's individual rights. This is not to suggest that a pre-liberal era dismissed the idea of individual free choice. Among other significant ways that pre-liberal Christianity contributed to an expansion of human choice was to transform the idea of marriage from an institution based upon familial and property considerations to a choice made by consenting individuals on the basis of sacramental love. What was new is that the default basis for evaluating institutions, society, affiliations, memberships, and even personal relationships became dominated by considerations of individual choice based on the calculation of individuals' self-interest and without broader consideration of the impact of one's choices upon the community, one's obligations to the created order, and ultimately to God. Liberalism began with the explicit assertion that it merely describes our political, social, and private decision-making, yet it was implicitly constituted as a normative project. What it presented as a description of human voluntarism, in fact, had to displace a very different form of human self-understanding and experience. In effect, liberal theory sought to educate people to think differently about themselves and their relationships. Liberalism often claims neutrality about the choices people make in liberal society. It is the defender of right, not any particular conception of good. Yet it is not neutral about the basis on which people make their decisions. In the same way that courses in economics claim merely to describe human beings as utility-maximizing individual actors, but in fact influence students to act more selfishly, so liberalism teaches a people to hedge commitments and adopt flexible relationships and bonds. Not only are all political and economic relationships seen as fungible and subject to constant redefinition, so are all relationships to place, to neighborhood, to nation, to family, and to religion. Liberalism encourages loose connections. End quote. Okay, so there is his description of that radically autonomous individual and the connections between people, even going so far as to say the connections between children and parents are all subject to perpetual evaluation for whether or not one should consent and whether or not the benefits outweigh the costs. Everything is sort of impermanent and flexible. And so that fundamentally, regardless of the moral neutrality of whether one should or shouldn't do this or do that, the very premise that all of one's relationships are fundamentally based on consent and on a sort of a transactional quality is going to inherently have an ethical impact on one's decision-making process. So in the second revolution, the war against nature. Now this is the one that I want to pay a little more attention to. When he describes this one, he says, quote, "The second revolution and the second anthropological assumption that constitutes liberalism is less visibly political. Pre-modern political thought, particularly that informed by an Aristotelian understanding of natural science, understood the human creature as part of a comprehensive natural order. Humans were understood to have a telos, a fixed end, given by nature and unalterable. Human nature was continuous with the order of the natural world, and thus humanity was required to conform both to its own nature and, in a broader sense, to the natural order of which it was a part. Human beings could act freely against their own nature and the natural order, but such actions deformed them and harmed the good of human beings and the world. Aristotle's Ethics and Aquinas' Summa Theologia are alike efforts to delineate the limits that nature, natural law, places upon human beings. Each seeks to educate man about how best to live within those limits through the practice of virtues to achieve a condition of human flourishing. Liberal philosophy rejected this requirement of human self-limitation. It displaced first the idea of a natural order to which humanity is subject, and later the notion of human nature itself. Liberalism inaugurated a transformation in the natural and human sciences and humanity's relationship to the natural world. The first wave of this revolution, inaugurated by early modern thinkers dating back to the Renaissance, insisted that man should employ natural science and a transformed economic system to seek mastery of nature. The second wave, developed largely by various historicist schools of thought, especially in the 19th century, replaced belief in the idea of a fixed human nature with belief in human plasticity and capacity for moral progress. These two iterations of liberalism, often labeled conservative and progressive, contend today for ascendance, but we do better to understand their deep interconnection. The proto-liberal thinker who ushered in the first wave of liberalism's transformation was Francis Bacon. Like Hobbes, who was Bacon's secretary, he attacked the ancient Aristotelian and Thomistic understanding of nature and natural law, and argued for the human capacity to master or control nature, even reversing the effects of the fall, including even the possibility of overcoming human mortality. Liberalism became closely bound up with this new orientation of the natural sciences, and it embraced and advanced, as well, an economic system, market-based free enterprise, that similarly promoted human use, conquest, and mastery of the natural world. Early modern liberalism held the view that human nature was unchangeable. Human beings were, by nature, self-interested creatures, whose base impulses could be harnessed, but not fundamentally altered. But this self-interested, possessive aspect of our nature could, if usefully harnessed, promote an economic and scientific system that increased human freedom through the capacity of human beings to exert mastery over natural phenomena. The second wave of this revolution begins as an explicit criticism of this view of humanity. Thinkers ranging from Rousseau to Marx, from Mill to Dewey, and from Richard Rorty to contemporary transhumanists reject the idea that human nature is fixed. They adopt the first wave theorists' idea that nature is subject to human conquest and apply it to human nature itself. First wave liberals are today represented by conservatives, who stress the need for scientific and economic mastery of nature, but stop short of extending this project to human nature. They support nearly any utilitarian use of the world for economic ends, but oppose most forms of biotechnological enhancement. Second-wave liberals increasingly approve nearly any technical means of liberating humans from the biological nature of our own bodies. Today's political debates occur largely and almost exclusively between these two varieties of liberals. Neither side confronts the fundamentally alternative understanding of human nature and the human relationship to nature defended by the pre-liberal tradition. Liberalism is thus not merely, as is often portrayed, a narrowly political project of constitutional government and juridical defense of rights. Rather, it seeks to transform all of human life and the world. Its two revolutions, its anthropological individualism and the voluntarist conception of choice, and its insistence on the human separation from and opposition to nature, created its distinctive and new understanding of liberty as the most extensive possible expansion of the human sphere of autonomous activity. End quote. Okay, so there you see two branches of this particular revolution. The first branch being the imposition of human control and human mastery over the natural world through the project of science and technology. This concept that humans have the capacity and indeed the imperative to shape, control, and extract value from nature and the natural environment is represented, in Deneen's view, by the modern conservatives, who are really like maybe classical liberals, could be considered conservatives. But the modern conservative argument doesn't take this sort of idea that we have limits on the methods and the ends to which we put our exploitation of the natural world. The second wave of this particular revolution simply applies that same human mastery over nature to human nature itself, and says that we are not bound by our biology, we are not bound by our mentality, we are free to do and be anything we want to be. This ties in with the unconstrained vision that Thomas Sowell talked about, in the sense that, you know, it frees us from being bound by some sort of distinct human nature. And I like the way he talks about technological changes as well, because when we talk about things like abortion, which, you know, I don't really want to get into in this podcast, I don't feel like it's really part of what I'm trying to do, but as a concept, it says, you know, your biological function in the reproduction of the species is something that you can have mastery over. Even your sex and your gender you can have mastery over. You can change your gender. You can get a sex change. You're not bound in any way. And I find this really, really strange and disconcerting, and yet really accurate, because for my own personal background, I tended in my youth to be more of a sort of a hippie kind of guy. Traveling the country with a bunch of neo-hippies or whatever in the 90s, and, you know, camping out in nature and everything, and just being real like a crunchy granola type, if you will, and I always viewed that as kind of a left-wing type of way to be, right? And that's, I guess I considered myself a Democrat, because I felt like it was just the whole left Democrat mentality was that kind of a respect for nature. But now, as I get older and I look around to what the rest of the world seems to present, although there's an appreciation for the natural world to an extent on the left, and the exploitation of the external nature seems to be maybe restrained in some ways on the left, the concept of being bound or even having any reverence for one's own nature is totally gone, you know. So the person who wants to, surgically transform themselves into a genderless alien, I'm sure you've heard of this guy, you can bet your bottom dollar he's a Democrat, or at very least he leans Democrat. That's not a Republican way to be, to completely recreate your entire body into some conceptual thing that doesn't have any place in the natural world. You know, that's actually the direction, and the transhumanism in general is sort of the direction that much of leftism takes, which was a bit of a surprise to me as I came to understand that. Anyway, so that second revolution of human mastery and opposition to nature as being fundamental to liberalism is where I want to direct a little bit more of my analysis of this book in that particular direction, because it's also fundamental to what I'm trying to do with this podcast is rebind modern conservatism to a respect for nature, not just a respect of our own nature, a respect for our mental nature, a respect for our physical nature, but a respect for the external natural world, and an understanding of the limits, not only the limits that we have imposed upon us biologically and physiologically and psychologically, but also a respect for the boundaries and bounds of the circumstances in which we find ourselves here on planet Earth, and the necessity of having a respect and a symbiotic relationship with the natural world in which we find ourselves. So that's his basic explanation for what liberalism is. Now, the book is Why Liberalism Failed. So the premise here is that these ideas don't actually work. And so jumping back a little bit toward the beginning, in the introduction, he talks about the fact that his proposal that liberalism has failed. And he says, quote, "Liberalism has failed, not because it fell short, but because it was true to itself. It has failed because it has succeeded. As liberalism has become more fully itself, as its inner logic has become more evident, and its self-contradictions manifest, it has generated pathologies that are at once deformations of its claims, yet realizations of liberal ideology. A political philosophy that was launched to foster greater equity, defend a pluralist tapestry of different cultures and beliefs, protect human dignity, and of course expand liberty, in practice generates titanic inequality, enforces uniformity and homogeneity, fosters material and spiritual degradation, and undermines freedom. Its success can be measured by its achievement of the opposite of what we have believed it would achieve. Rather than seeing the accumulating catastrophe as evidence of our failure to live up to liberalism's ideals, we need rather to see clearly that the ruins it has produced are the signs of its very success. To call for the cures of liberalism's ills by applying more liberal measures is tantamount to throwing gas on a raging fire. It will only deepen our political, social, economic, and moral crisis. This may be a moment for more than mere institutional tinkering. If indeed something more fundamental and transformative than normal politics is happening, then we are in the midst not just of a political realignment, characterized by the dying gasp of an old white working class and the lashing out of debt-burdened youth. We may rather be witnessing an increasingly systemic failure due to the bankruptcy of its underlying political philosophy, of the political system we have largely taken for granted. The fabric of beliefs that gave rise to the nearly 250-year-old American constitutional experiment may be nearing an end. While a number of our founding fathers believed they had lighted on a new science of politics that would resist the inevitable tendency of all regimes to decay and eventually die, even comparing the constitutional order to an entropy-defying perpetual motion device, a machine that would go of itself, we should rightly wonder whether America is not in the early days of its eternal life, but rather approaching the end of the natural cycle of corruption and decay that limits the lifespan of all human creations. This political philosophy has been for modern Americans like water for a fish, an encompassing political ecosystem in which we have swum unaware of its existence. Liberalism is the first of the modern world's three great competitor political ideologies, and with the demise of fascism and communism, it is the only ideology still with a claim to viability. As ideology, liberalism was the first political architecture that proposed transforming all aspects of human life to conform to a preconceived political plan. We live in a society and increasingly a world that has been remade in the image of an ideology, the first nation founded by the explicit embrace of liberal philosophy, whose citizenry is shaped almost entirely by its commitments and vision. But unlike the visibly authoritarian regimes that arose in dedication to advancing the ideologies of fascism and communism, Liberalism is less visibly ideological, and only surreptitiously remakes the world in its image. In contrast to its crueler competitor ideologies, liberalism is more insidious. As an ideology, it pretends to neutrality, claiming no preference and denying any intention of shaping the souls under its rule. It ingratiates by invitation to the easy liberties, diversions, and attractions of freedom, pleasure, and wealth. It makes itself invisible, much as a computer's operating system goes largely unseen until it crashes. Liberalism becomes daily more visible, precisely because its deformations are becoming too obvious to ignore. As Socrates tells us in Plato's Republic, most humans, in most times and places, occupy a cave, believing it to be a complete reality. What's most insidious about the cave that we occupy is that its walls are like the backdrops of old movie sets, promising seemingly endless vistas without constraints or limits, and thus our containment remains invisible to us. Among the few iron laws of politics, few seem more unbreakable than the ultimate unsustainability of ideology in politics. Ideology fails for two reasons. First, because it is based on falsehood about human nature, and hence can't help but fail. And second, because as those falsehoods become more evident, the gap grows between what the ideology claims and the lived experience of human beings under its domain, until the regime loses legitimacy. Either it enforces conformity to a lie it struggles to defend, or it collapses when the gap between claim and reality finally results in wholesale loss of belief among the populace. More often than not, one precedes the other. Thus, even as liberalism has penetrated nearly every nation on earth, its vision of human liberty seems increasingly to be a taunt rather than a promise. Far from celebrating the utopic freedom at the end of history that seemed within grasp when the last competing ideology fell in 1989, humanity comprehensively shaped by liberalism is today burdened by the miseries of its success. It pervasively finds itself to be caught in a trap of its own making, entangled in the very apparatus that was supposed to grant pure and unmitigated freedom. We can see this today especially in four distinct but connected areas of our common life: politics and government, economics, education, and science and technology. In each of these domains, liberalism has transformed human institutions in the name of expanding liberty and increasing our mastery and control of our fates. And in each case, widespread anger and deepening discontent have arisen from the spreading realization that the vehicles of our liberation have become iron cages of our captivity. End quote. So in that section, when he's talking about the failure of liberalism, he mentions the fact that it is one of three different competing ideologies. The first of those, he says, liberalism is the first of the modern world's three great competitor political ideologies. And with the demise of fascism and communism, it is the only ideology still with a claim to viability. So what you have is liberalism first as an ideology, born with John Locke and the Enlightenment and the ideas of the Enlightenment, and slowly instituted across America and then across the world. And then following that, you had the rise of communism in the as an idea generated in the 19th century, mid to late 19th century, and then implemented in communist Russia in the early 20th century. Shortly later, you had the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy. And those were the three ideologies. And then fascism was destroyed in World War II. And then with the fall of the Iron Curtain, the end of the Cold War, you had the end of communism as an ideology. And liberalism is the last one standing. And it has been much more subtle in its control. And so maybe that allowed it to exist for a longer period of time. And maybe the fact that it has driven out all of its competitors has allowed it to last, but it too is beginning to show signs of dysfunction. And he claims basically that he makes a point here that I think is important to us. It will be important to us moving forward. He says that among the iron laws of politics, few seem more unbreakable than the ultimate unsustainability of ideology in politics. What does that mean? The unsustainability of ideology in politics. Well, we have to understand what he means by ideology. We've talked a little bit about ideology in this podcast in early episodes, but essentially what he means here is the notion of generating a vision of the way human relations should be, crafting a sort of a vision about, or a concept, a rationalized concept of how people are and could be and should be, and then implementing that on society. It's sort of a top-down approach. Come up with the idea and then shape society to fit the idea. Liberalism does it, communism did it, and fascism did it. He also talks about Aristotle's ethics and Aquinas' Summa Theologiae, and essentially these are defining the limits that nature places upon human beings, in other words, natural law. The fact that we have there's a certain law that we have to follow based on the very existence of our nature. So it seeks, as he says, to educate man about how best to live within those limits through the practice of virtues to achieve a condition of human flourishing. This is essentially self-mastery. It's a form of liberty that frees oneself from the baser desires. It's not simply the ability to do whatever you want, but the ability to live and thrive and flourish given the limits that nature places upon us, and in order to enact a sense of self-mastery and self-rule. And when we talk about self-rule in the sense of democracy and ruling, having a say in how one's government is run, that the older version of liberty also had a sense of self-rule in the sense of ruling over one's baser desires or ruling over one's vices. And so that sense of virtue was important in classical, in other words, pre-Christian ancient philosophy as well as Christian philosophy. I am going to, for reasons I'll explain at a later time, spend more time exploring the classical and ancient virtues, but I think it's important to point that out, that in order to live in accord with the limits of nature, one must cultivate virtues. That's kind of a concept here that we'll look at in more detail. So, given these three different ideologies, with liberalism beginning to fail, we can look to pre-liberal ideas, the pre-liberal tradition, or the Protestant construction, as Yoram Hazony defined it in The Virtue of Nationalism, or looking back to kind of taking from all of pre-liberal history, so looking back even to the ancient world for some ideas of how we should be structuring our society, and what is really in opposition to this ideology. Are we just going to come up with another ideology to replace the ideologies we have, and then find that ideology doesn't work either because of this iron law of politics that he mentions, the ultimate unsustainability of ideology in politics? Ultimately, what we need to do is to break out of this concept, or this habit, if you will, of coming up with ideologies and then trying to impose them. That's the fundamental problem here with all three of these political ideologies. So at this point, I'm going to move on a little bit. At the end of that section, he talked about four distinct but connected areas of our common life: politics and government, economics, education, and science and technology. These are the areas where liberalism has transformed human institutions. So of those four, I want to take a moment to talk about, as you can probably imagine, science and technology, because that kind of ties in with some of the points that I'm trying to shine a light on in this book. So in the section where he talks about this science and technology, he says, quote, "Liberalism's tools for liberating humanity from various forms of bondage were especially to be achieved through transformations in politics, namely the representative system that today seems out of our control, economics, particularly market capitalism, whose globalizing logic cannot be resisted, and science and technology, arguably the greatest source of our liberation and simultaneously the reason for our imperiled environment, the deformations wrought by our own technologies on our personhood, and deep anxiety over our inability to control our own innovations. The modern scientific project of human liberation from the tyranny of nature has been framed as an effort to master or control nature, or as a war against nature, in which its study would provide the tools for its subjugation at the hands of humans. Francis Bacon, who rejected classical arguments that learning aimed at the virtues of wisdom, prudence, and justice, argued instead that knowledge is power, compared nature to a prisoner who, under torture, might be compelled to reveal her long-withheld secrets. Even if we do not speak in these terms anymore, the modern scientific project now dominates what we regard as useful and rewarding inquiry. Yet nature seems not to have surrendered. As the farmer and author Wendell Berry has written, if modern science and technology were conceived as a war against nature, then it is a war in every sense. Nature is fighting us as much as we are fighting it, and it appears that we are losing. Many elements of what we today call our environmental crisis, climate change, resource depletion, groundwater contamination and scarcity, species extinction, are signs of battles won but a war being lost. Today we are accustomed to arguing that we should follow the science in an issue such as climate change, ignoring that our crisis is the result of long-standing triumphs of science and technology, in which following science was tantamount to civilizational progress. Our carbon-saturated world is the hangover of a 150-year party in which, until the very end, we believed we had achieved the dream of liberation from nature's constraints. We still hold the incoherent view that science can liberate us from the limits. We still hold the incoherent view that science can liberate us from limits while solving the attendant consequences of that project. Meanwhile, we are increasingly shaped by technology that promises liberation from limits of space, time, and even identity. The computer in every person's pocket has been shown to change the structure of our minds, turning us into different creatures, conforming us to the demands and nature of a technology that is supposed to allow expression of our true selves. How many of us can sit for an hour reading a book or simply thinking or meditating without an addict's longing for just a hit of the cell phone, that craving that won't allow us to think or concentrate or reflect until we've had our hit? This same technology that is supposed to connect us more extensively and intimately is making us more lonely, more apart. Devices increasingly replace humans in the workplace, apparently granting us liberty, but making us our technology's ward and helpmeet. And advances in the manipulation of nature inevitably raise the possibility of remaking humanity itself, potentially pitting humanity 2.0 against those who refuse or can't afford to shuck version 1.0. What is supposed to allow us to transform our world is instead transforming us, making us into creatures to which many, if not most of us, have not given our consent. It is making us ever more into the creatures that liberalism supposed was our nature in that state of nature that existed before the coming of civilization, law, and government. Ironically, but not perhaps coincidentally, the political project of liberalism is shaping us into the creatures of its prehistorical fantasy, which in fact required the combined massive apparatus of the modern state, economy, education system, and science and technology to make us into increasingly separate, autonomous, non-relational selves, replete with rights and defined by our liberty, but insecure, powerless, afraid, and alone. End quote. So yeah, that's kind of a fairly harsh judgment on science and technology, and I think there are a few points in here that are important. Number one, when he talks about our environmental crisis of climate change and the other things that he mentions, resource depletion, etc., the common refrain always seems to be, not always, but oftentimes, particularly among active liberals, seems to be that science is going to fix this problem. That we need to study different ways of generating energy, and we need to follow the science. And I even heard it argued on a podcast that I listened to that the simple premise that because this is a technical problem, it's going to require a technical solution, which makes sense, I suppose. But when you understand that we lived in a world for thousands and thousands of years under a sort of a superstition, and there may have been suffering. In fact, there certainly was suffering, but one thing that we didn't face during any of that time was planetary existential crises, the threat of nuclear annihilation, the threat of climate change wiping out entire species, perhaps including us, massive areas being deforested and turned into wasteland in some cases. The massive problems that we have created, the massive overpopulation of the planet, all these things were facilitated by science, and we should remember that. And I'm not anti-science. Science is the method by which we acquire the truth about the world. It's better than superstition in telling us the way the material world actually works and what actually has happened in the past and what we can expect for the future, and information about who and what we are as human beings. But we can't be blind to the consequences of science and its applied technology run amok. And there are three things he kind of talks about. In this section, he only talks about the first two of these, but he talked about the imperiled environment, the deformations wrought by our technologies on our personhood, and then there's a third thing that he talks about. I didn't quote this section, but he does talk about the third, the deep anxiety over our inability to control our own innovations. And we see this in a lot of popular media, like The Matrix or Terminator or whatever, like different, the sense that, and we have this not just in our media, but in ourselves, that there's no turning the technological tide. It is following a course of its own, and we are along for the ride. That's kind of the sense that, whatever, as soon as the technology is created, it will happen. Human cloning, it will happen. Human mixing human DNA with animal DNA to create a new version of humanity, it will happen. Plugging our brains into the internet, it will happen. It doesn't matter what it is. If we can do it, we will do it eventually. And so there's sort of a sense of anxiety that we're not really in control here. And anyone arguing against this sort of thing is just fighting a useless battle against the tide. So those are kind of the three areas where he sees the liberal mentality kind of failing in practice in the world of science and technology. So then I do want to go to a section here where he begins to talk about culture and how our war against nature is embedded in our culture and how our culture facilitates that. And so I want to read this section here. He says, quote, "One of liberalism's main revolutions was not in the narrowly political realm, but in its disassociation of nature from culture. The fundamental premise of liberalism is that the natural condition of man is defined above all by the absence of culture, and that, by contrast, the presence of culture marks existence of artifice and convention, the simultaneous effort to alter but conform to nature. In its earliest articulation, liberal anthropology assumed that natural man was a cultureless creature, existing in a state of nature, noteworthy for the absence of any artifice created by humans. For the proto-liberal Hobbes, the state of nature was explicitly the sphere where no culture was possible because it lacked the conditions in which stability, continuity, cultural transmission, and memory could exist. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for all his opposition to Hobbes, conceived the state of nature as a place of relative peace and stability, but nevertheless strikingly similar to Hobbes's in its absence of cultural forms, and fundamentally identical in the radical autonomy of its proto-human inhabitants. Despite its romantic rejection of the cold, rationalist, and utilitarian Hobbesian picture of humanity, Rousseau's primitivist alternative nevertheless reveals continuity among all iterations of liberalism in its fundamental commitment to the severance of nature from culture. While today we can still speak of differences of nature and nurture, even the possibility of a divide between these two would have been incomprehensible to pre-liberal humanity. The revolutionary nature of the break introduced by liberalism is discernible even in the very word culture. Culture is a word with deep connections to natural forms and processes, most obviously in words such as agriculture or cultivate. Just as the potential of a plant or animal isn't possible without cultivation, so it was readily understood that the human creature's best potential simply could not be realized without good culture. This was so evident to ancient thinkers that the first several chapters of Plato's Republic are devoted not to a discussion of political forms, but to the kinds of stories that are appropriate for children. In a suggestive statement winding up his introductory chapter in the Politics, Aristotle declares that the first lawmaker is especially praiseworthy for inaugurating governance over food and sex, that is, the two elemental human desires that are most in need of cultivation and civilization. For food, the development of manners that encourage a moderate appetite and civilized consumption, and for sex, the cultivation of customs and habits of courtship, mannered interaction between the sexes, and finally marriage as the container of the otherwise combustible and fraught domain of sexuality. People who are uncultivated in the consumption of both food and sex, Aristotle observed, are the most vicious of creatures, literally consuming other humans to slake their base and untutored appetites. Far from being understood as opposites of human nature, customs and manners were understood to be derived from, governed by, and necessary to the realization of human nature. A core ambition of liberalism is the liberation of such appetites from the artificial constraints of culture, either to liberate them entirely as a condition of our freedom, or, where they require constraint, to place them under the uniform and homogenized governance of promulgated law, rather than the inconstant impositions and vagaries of diverse cultures. While liberalism describes itself as mainly an effort to constrain and limit government, its earliest architects readily admitted that a powerful and often arbitrary government acting upon prerogative was necessary to secure the basic conditions of freedom and its requisite stability. From the outset, proponents of liberalism understood that cultural constraints over expression and pursuit of appetite were obstacles to the realization of a society premised upon unleashing erstwhile vices, such as greed, as engines of economic dynamism, and that state power might be required to overturn cultural institutions responsible for containing such appetites. Today, with the success of the liberal project in the economic sphere, the powers of the liberal state are increasingly focused on dislocating those remaining cultural institutions that were responsible for governance of consumer and sexual appetite, purportedly in the name of freedom and equality, but above all in a comprehensive effort to displace cultural forms as the ground condition of liberal liberty. Only constraints approved by the liberal state itself can finally be acceptable. The assumption is that legitimate limits upon liberty can arise only from the authority of the consent-based liberal state. The liberation of the autonomous individual requires not only the waxing state apparatus, but the expansive project of conquering nature. This end as well rested most fundamentally upon the notional, and then increasingly real, Elimination of Culture. Culture is the convention by which humans interact responsibly with nature, at once conforming to its governance while introducing human ingenuity and invention within its limits and boundaries. A healthy culture is akin to healthy agriculture. While clearly a form of human artifice, agriculture that takes into account local conditions or place intends to maintain fecundity over generations or time, and so must work with the facts of given nature, not approach nature as an obstacle to the attainment of one's unbound appetites. Modern, industrialized agriculture works on the liberal model that apparent natural limits are to be overcome through short-term solutions whose consequences will be left for future generations. These solutions include the introduction of petroleum-based fertilizers that increased crop yields but contribute to hypoxic zones in lakes and oceans, genetically engineered crops that encourage increased use of herbicides and pesticides and whose genetic lines can't be contained or predicted. The widespread use of plant monocultures that displace local varieties and local practices, and the use in cattle of antibiotics that have accelerated genetic mutations in bacteria and thus decreased these medicines' usefulness for the human population. Industrial processes like these ignore the distinctive demands of local culture and practice, and rely fundamentally on the elimination of existing farming cultures as the essence of agriculture. While purportedly forward-looking, this approach is profoundly presentist and placeless. A culture develops above all in awareness of nature's limits, offerings, and demands. This awareness is not theorized, but is a lived reality that often cannot be described until it has ceased to exist. Liberalism, by contrast, has aimed consistently at disassociating cultural forms from nature. The effect is at once to liberate humans from acknowledgement of nature's limits, while rendering culture into wholly relativist belief and practice, untethered from anything universal or enduring. The aim of mastering nature toward the end of liberating humanity from its limits, a project inaugurated in the thought of Francis Bacon, was simultaneously an assault on cultural norms and practices developed alongside nature. The imperative to overcome culture, as part of the project of mastering nature, was expressed with forthright clarity by John Dewey, one of liberalism's great heroes. Dewey insisted that the progress of liberation rested especially upon the active control of nature, and hence required the displacement of traditional beliefs and culture that reflected a backward and limiting regard for the past. He described these two approaches to the human relationship to nature as civilized versus savage. The savage tribe manages to live in the desert, he wrote, by adapting itself to the natural limits of its environment. Thus, its adaptation involves a maximum of accepting, tolerating, putting up with things as they are, a maximum of passive acquiescence, and a minimum of active control of subjection to use. A civilized people in the same desert also adapts, but it introduces irrigation. It searches the world for plants and animals that will flourish under such conditions. It improves, by careful selection, those which are growing there. As a consequence, the wilderness blossoms. As a rose, the savage is merely habituated. The civilized man has habits which transform the environment. Dewey traces his thought back to Francis Bacon, whom he considered the most important thinker in history. Bacon, he wrote in his Reconstruction in Philosophy, teaches that scientific laws do not lie on the surface of nature. They are hidden and must be wrested from nature by an active and elaborate technique of inquiry. The scientist must force the apparent facts of nature into forms different to those in which they familiarly present themselves, and thus make them tell the truth about themselves, as torture may compel an unwilling witness to reveal what he has been concealing. Today's liberals recoil from such bald expressions of hubris, but rather than reject Dewey's effort to eliminate culture toward the end of dominating nature, they are inclined to accept the liberal belief in human separateness from nature and insist upon the conquest of humanity, whether through the technological control of the natural world, conservative liberals, or the technological control of reproduction and mastery of the human genetic code, progressive liberals. A core feature of the liberal project is antipathy to culture as a deep relationship with a nature that defines and limits human nature. End quote. So that's an important and often overlooked concept here, that in liberalism's effort to free us from all boundaries, we have to free us from the boundaries imposed upon us by nature, and in order to do that, we have to eliminate all cultural elements that acquiesce to nature. Anything that is going to promote a limited, symbiotic, accepting relationship with nature must be eliminated to make room for a new approach to the interaction with nature that is more dominating and exploitative, in order to give humans the maximum capacity to be perfectly liberated from reality, in a way, from nature, more specifically. And I think that's something that is important for us to keep in mind. A good, healthy culture is a culture that has developed over a long period of time in order to, there are two things that he mentions, place and time, so that, it says, as he describes, he says, a healthy culture is akin to healthy agriculture. While clearly a form of artifice, agriculture that takes into account local conditions and intends to maintain fecundity over generations, and so must work with the facts of given nature, not approach nature as an obstacle to the attainment of one's unbound appetites. So rather than bind ourselves, bind our appetites and constrain our appetites so as to fit within the natural environment in which we find ourselves, we want to have unbound, unrestricted appetites. And in order to satiate these unbound and unrestricted appetites, we must have an unbound and unrestricted interaction with the natural world, so that we don't take into account local conditions or place, and we don't take into account connection with the past and the future. We shed all of these connections in order to be totally free to fulfill our unbound appetites. And I think that this is sort of a perspective that conservatives need to begin to recognize. If we're going to talk about human nature, and we're going to talk about respect for the past and the future, and traditional continuity, and we're going to talk about rootedness and a sense of place, and we're going to talk about these things that are parts of tradition and a respect for tradition, we're going to have to shed this notion that our interaction with nature is not subject to these same sorts of constraints, and is not subject to the same degree of reverence for tradition. So, yeah, and I also think it's really interesting how culture, he describes culture as being fundamentally part of human nature, so that the liberal conception of human nature is a human being outside of culture, and the pre-liberal concept of human nature was that it was a human being bound inside nature. Even though modern science has kind of given us a vision of humanity as evolving from a previous, an early state of Homo erectus or what have you, the early humans, the early state of human evolution was most certainly at some point traces back to a pre-civilizational state, a pre-cultural state. Some component of quasi-culture is present even in modern primates, like chimpanzees. That there's a hierarchy, and so there's a sort of a quasi-culture that we carry with us from time immemorial. And so as human beings, culture, and particularly a more developed culture, is part of who we are. It's fundamental to us, and we should view ourselves that way and view our culture that way, as long as we view culture as in opposition to nature, and we're never going to free ourselves from culture. Therefore, we're never going to bind ourselves to nature. That's kind of the modern view, is that, well, you can't go back to nature, so to speak, because you're bound in a culture. And that oppositional perspective needs to be overcome, I believe. So I'm going to wrap things up here. I've got one more section I want to read. And this is about the future after liberalism. As liberalism fails more and more deeply, where do we go from here? He essentially claims that there are three things that must be taken into account. The first of them is that the achievements of liberalism must be acknowledged. The second of them is that we must outgrow the age of ideology. And the third is that through practice, habit, and experience, a better theory of politics is going to emerge. So on the first of those, well, I'm going to read a section. He talks about all three of those sequentially, and I'm going to read a little bit of all of them, I suppose, and then I'll talk about it a little bit. But first of all, in regards to not being able to return to a pre-liberal age, he says we should recognize the achievements of liberalism and recognize that we can't actually go to a pre-liberal state. It's impossible to forget what we have learned and forget the experiences that we have been through. We will always be in a post-liberal state. He says, quote, "Like all human projects, liberalism is not without its achievements. Living within its cave, liberal humanity has been too self-congratulatory about its successes, hence the need to show in these pages its deeper costs. But if we hope to create a humane, post-liberal future, we cannot pretend that the age of liberalism did not happen, or that its basic contours can simply be jettisoned in some sort of restoration of an idyllic pre-liberal age. That age never existed, though at the same time the past can and ought to instruct as we move forward toward new possibilities. Any steps toward a post-liberal age must begin with a sympathetic appreciation of liberalism's appeal, and an effort to realize the admirable ideals that liberalism often only promised. While liberalism pretended to be a wholly new edifice that rejected the political architecture of all previous ages, it naturally drew upon long developments, from antiquity to the late Middle Ages. A significant part of its appeal was not that it was something wholly new, but that it drew upon deep reservoirs of belief and commitment. Ancient political philosophy was especially devoted to the question of how best to avoid the rise of tyranny and how best to achieve the conditions of political liberty and self-governance. The basic terms that inform our political tradition, liberty, equality, dignity, justice, constitutionalism, are of ancient pedigree. The advent of Christianity and its development in the now largely neglected political philosophy of the Middle Ages emphasized the dignity of the individual, the concept of the person, the existence of rights and corresponding duties, the paramount importance of civil society and a multiplicity of associations, and the concept of limited government as the best means of forestalling the inevitable human temptation toward tyranny. Liberalism's most basic appeal was not its rejection of the past, but its reliance upon basic concepts that were foundational to the Western political identity." End quote. He's saying that liberalism is not something that was a pure break from everything that came before. There's simply no way to do something like that, and we shouldn't look at it as that. It was carrying on many of the traditions from the pre-liberal era. Some of those good, some of those I think not as good. I think that there's a sort of universalism to the liberal era, that it adopted from Christianity, being that Christianity presented itself as a universal doctrine that applied to all mankind, as opposed to a particular religion or set of beliefs that applied to a particular people, sort of like Judaism. That was their religion. That wasn't intended to be the religion of everyone. They were perfectly happy to preserve, the Jews were perfectly happy to preserve their traditions and to make sure that they, as a people, survived, but not necessarily to convert the world to being Jewish. That was not their objective. Christianity was universalist. Its objective was to spread the word and that all people ultimately can be saved by Jesus Christ. It was a much more, and so liberalism carries that universalist, the idea of the universal truth that applies to all mankind, carries that notion with it. I think that's a flaw. I think that's a weakness, as to some degree we talked about in the last episode, although Hazoni doesn't pin that to Christianity. I'm inclined to do so. But at any rate, so there have been good things that have come from liberalism, in so far as, to some extent our science and technology is not wholly bad. It's not completely and utterly bad. As I've stated, it's the best method for arriving at the truth regarding the material world and human nature and everything else. Or perhaps not human nature, that's debatable, but the nature of where we come from, things like that, the distant past, what it looked like. Science serves a function. It's not something we want to just jettison. And other concepts of liberalism, the devotion to self-rule. But, many of these things, like you said, come from deep within the Western tradition. They weren't just created. So, like, democracy was not invented by liberalism. Democracy existed in ancient Greece. But nonetheless, we should look at liberalism. We should recognize its achievements and want to preserve its achievements, and not attempt to go to a pre-liberal era. We can only go to a post-liberal era. So that's the first of those. The second one, the second idea about what a post-liberal era must take into account is the end of ideology. He says, quote, "Liberalism was launched with the claim that it would take men as they are, grounding a new politics upon a clear-sighted realism about human nature. Yet its claims about humans as they are were premised upon the fiction of radically autonomous humans in a state of nature. The political, social, and economic order shaped around this disfigured view of human nature succeeded in remaking people in this image, but the project had the predictable effect of liberating them from the reality of relational life. Liberalism has always been animated by a vision of how humans ought to live, but it masked these normative commitments in the guise of neutrality. Like its competitor ideologies, it called forth a massive political and economic apparatus to fulfill its vision, in the process both reshaping and damaging humanity. A more humane politics must avoid the temptation to replace one ideology with another. Politics and human community must percolate from the bottom up, from experience and practice. One of liberalism's most damaging fictions was the theory of consent, an imaginary scenario in which autonomous rational calculators formed an abstract contract to establish a government whose sole purpose was to secure rights. This view of consent relegated all unchosen forms of society and relationships to the category of arbitrary, and thus suspect, if not illegitimate. Liberalism today has successfully expanded itself from a political project to a social and even familial one, acting most often as solvent upon all social bonds. Yet, as liberalism faces more challenging frontiers, especially those religious institutions that fundamentally reject liberal premises, we witness an increasingly visible and active government advancing its project through efforts to control religious and familial practice and belief." End quote. So here is this concept of ideology that I mentioned earlier, and the top-down sense of crafting a vision, which is not accurate because a true understanding of human nature can never be achieved by any person or group of people. It can only be discovered and come closer to bit by bit through evolutionary processes like I described in the last episode of trial and error and not just conceived and imposed. And that is ideology, that it was conceived from above and imposed downward. He says that politics and human community must percolate from the bottom up, from experience and practice. And that is like along the lines of this third component here, the advent of post-liberal practice and toward a new birth of theory. He says, quote, "Already there is evidence of growing hunger for an organic alternative to the cold, bureaucratic, and mechanized world liberalism offers. While especially evident in the remnants of orthodox religious traditions, not only in self-contained communities like the Amish, but increasingly in growing international movements of Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and others, there is also growing interest in proposals for a Benedict option, most interestingly proposed and explored in the book of that name by Rod Dreher. The building up of practices of care, patience, humility, reverence, respect, and modesty is also evident among people of no particular religious belief, homesteaders and radical homemakers, who, like their religious counterparts, are seeking within households and local communities and marketplaces to rediscover old practices and create new ones that foster new forms of culture that liberalism otherwise seeks to eviscerate. Often called a counterculture, such efforts should better understand themselves as a counter-anti-culture. Building a culture in the midst of today's anti-culture is a profound challenge because of the flattened cultural wasteland produced by modern liberalism, as well as its jealous hostility to competitors. A culture is built from the bottom up, and like an organism, it maintains its DNA by passing itself on to subsequent generations. A self-conscious effort to build a new culture exists in basic contradiction to more organic origins and development of cultural practice, yet the unique context of liberalism's blighted cultural landscape demands something new. Ironically, given the default choice-based philosophy that liberalism has bequeathed to us, what might someday become a non-voluntarist cultural landscape must be born out of voluntarist intentions, plans, and actions." End quote. So essentially he's saying there that religious communities, as well as many non-religious people in communities, are striving to create traditions, recover old traditions, and basically begin to live a life that is infused with tradition and culture and connection to the natural world. He mentions homesteaders and radical homemakers, people who are trying to, in some sense, get back to the land, or to localize their communities, make purchasing from farmers markets rather than from big box stores. People who are trying to reinvigorate a cultural sense rooted in place and rooted in connections across generations and rooted in stability. That this sort of effort is, to some extent, going to have to be created from scratch, given how much our cultural ties to the past have been so thoroughly annihilated and devastated by modern liberalism. And so I'm going to wrap it up at that, but I do want to mention that this all leads very nicely into the book I'll be reviewing next, which is called The Fourth Political Theory by Alexander Dugin, and it talks about this same sort of premise, but from another perspective, but essentially the concept that we need to develop a new political theory that is after liberalism, fascism, and communism. What will the fourth political theory look like? And so just as Patrick Deneen sort of explores what a post-liberal world would look like, and he uses the phrase political theory as well, he kind of seems as though he kind of describes ideology as this top-down cultural quasi-culture or anti-culture, this top-down imposition of practice based on ideology. And then he contrasts that with, it seems as though he contrasts that with a political theory that can be inferred from practice, that through the trial and error practice of constructing a culture, we can determine some political theories from this observation of what works. So that's kind of this difference between an empirical understanding of political theory versus a rationalist perspective on political theory and ideology. So anyway, that's all for now. Have a look at my social media if you want to comment about this episode or any other episodes, or just to get updates of when new episodes arrive. I'm also on Patreon if you enjoy the show and want to support it. And I will see you next time when we look at the fourth political theory. Adios.